On today's episode, we talk about how great it is that a Florida landlord is kicking out tenants for not being vaccinated, how libertarianism will usher in the destruction of our civilization, why all student debts should absolutely be canceled with no harms there, and how people who advocate for unborn lives make absolutely no sacrifices at all. This is Cringe Posts. Welcome to this episode of Cringe Posts. I'm Donald.
And I'm Britt.
And we're here to take on the online takes that make you cringe. But before we take on other people's cringy posts, we take on our own. We deal with our demons of the past. And so that is why we are starting off today's episode with this post from our co-host Britt here. And it's a simple 3-word public post to Facebook. Feels like crying. And what's funny about this is it does betray the date, right? When Facebook used to be in sort of that third person where it would be, Britt feels like crying, not just, whatever status was on your mind. So,
yep. And you forgot to include the 5 dots at the end of it. So it feels like crying, ... This just reminds me, the reason I cringed so much when I found this was that it reminded me of, first in 2008, I was in my teens and probably thinking about some girl or something like that. And it was like my way of it was like subtweeting before Twitter even existed in a lot of ways, right? Like I was trying to signal to this person that oh, I didn't like what you did, so I'm going to emotionally throw this out there.
Right.
Apologies for the big motorcycle going by on that.
Oh, yeah. It's making me feel like crying. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you can see there's one comment on there, and it was some other girl that I had been talking to. So, anyways, my whole goal for the tweeting or not tweeting, but for posting this on Facebook was I wanted people to ask me why I felt emotional, and it just makes me cringe to think. I think it was Jordan Peterson said that all teenage boys are somewhat sociopaths, and
right.
They're trying to emotionally manipulate people to feel or think or do something, and I definitely fell into that category. And I just I don't. There's a few others like this, and we'll probably do them later. But
yeah, well, and the thing is it's pretty normal and natural to be a little bit melodramatic in your teens over things. But we of course have the unfortunate reality of dealing with that in a time when you can publicly put it out in the world. And I'm pretty sure that I tried to not do that, but there are a couple of those, from my past as well. And it was really awkward because, of course, when you're doing it in public, if you're acting in this way in public, in person, you see who's around you in the moment. You know who you're angling for. But the funny thing is when you're posting it on Facebook, it's anyone you've added on Facebook. And so you'd sometimes get comments from the very people you didn't want to see, or like a relative, and you're like, oh no, this is the girl I like, I want her to see it, not my grandma, which is
I remember
so
specifically, man, this is how sociopathic I was. I remember specifically trying out okay, how could I make it so only she could see it? But then I realized, it has the little gear next to it that says share it with, specifically you. I was like, oh, then they'll know that I'm doing this. It's man, Brit of 2008, you're a crazy weirdo. Cut it out. Thankfully, I think I grew out of that. So I just lurk now. I don't even post. I keep that all inside me.
Yeah, well, the performative posting, unfortunately, is not something that's gone out of style in general, just from you. So we'll take a look at some posts and we'll see how cringy they are. So our first post comes from verified Twitter account, and we've slammed Occupy Democrats before on this show, and we're happy to do it again because they are the worst. Occupy Democrats posts, breaking. A large Florida landlord announces that he will begin requiring all new and existing tenants to provide proof of COVID vaccination, saying, you don't want to get vaccinated, you have to move, and if you don't, we will evict you. Retweet if you support the landlord's move. And first of all, the format is straight out of 2012 or something. Retweet if you like them.
That's like chain
share
mail.
If you're a good person. Yeah. Hey, ignore if you love watching.
If you love Satan,
rot.
Ignore. Yeah.
Right. So and I don't know that this is true, so I can't verify this. I haven't in my free time looked this up, but I heard that a rumor that the main person behind Occupy Democrats is a landlord, which is probably one of the great ironies of an Occupy Democrats movement page in general, because they were so much against, the bourgeoisie and the wealthy landlords is kind of one of their target people. And so the idea that this person's tweeting out, a large Florida landlord's, doing this heroic thing, retweet if you support them. Well, it could be them. I don't know if it is, but it's also just sort of like, yeah, not all landlords are bad.
That was so funny. I mean, I wish we had a one of their past posts, because I'm pretty sure they were probably freaking out when the eviction moratorium was going to end. And they weren't supporting landlords making decisions at that point, right? And that's what's crazy. I mean, about that whole thing, and it just shows that these people don't have an actual standard. It's all about power to them, and whatever decisions get them closer to power is what they want. But with the eviction moratorium, right? It was like full blown redistribution of property, right? You're taking property that people own and saying that other people can use it and abuse it for free, and then this is kind of like. Obviously you and I support free markets, so it's like, hey, if an idiot landlord really cares so much about this COVID vaccination thing that he's going to require tenants, like, all for it. And then all the other, landlords that want, any sort of tenant are going to get that type of tenant, right? And that's, but obviously, that's not the point these guys are trying to get across. They're trying to get across like, oh, well, this is everyone should get the vaccine, and the more we can squeeze you, the better.
The funny thing, a really easy limiting test on this principle is, are they going to celebrate in the same way, or maybe not celebrate, but at least accept, right? On principle, the same thing if a landlord did the same thing and required every tenant to be of a particular faith. Like if they required every tenant to be Christian, or maybe if you required every tenant to vote Republican, right? These are things that are choices. They are personal information that really a landlord doesn't necessarily need to know and should really have access to. But if you're all for landlords being able to, control their population, you might put it in this way with a vaccine mandate, well, then I would hope you would do the same with other similar private individual choices for their tenants. And of course, the rough thing with the landlord situation is, you and I would readily agree that this isn't even a very organic decision, right? When the government and the media has been propagating and publicly berating and humiliating anyone who wants to stand up against the COVID regime, it doesn't feel like a very organic choice that this landlord is making. It seems more like they've been sort of radicalized into it. But even regardless of that, the bigger problem being that it's not like the housing supply is in a super free market area because of so many districting and zoning laws and things like that, where housing has not been in the best state that it could be in the U.S. due to these kinds of imposing artificial restrictions put in by state and local governments. So it's frustrating because on the one hand, in principle, you and I agree, like, yes, a landlord should be able to do this, and we're going to say he or she has the right to do that. But on the other, it's frustrating because it doesn't feel genuine. It feels very artificially created. And in a free market, we would totally support this because, again, you would have all the customers going to other people, but unfortunately, the housing market isn't really free at the point where the government can say, no, you can't build houses here, or you have to build a certain type of house. You can't build any kind of housing, which, of course, goes against the idea of permissionless innovation.
Yeah, the thing that always gets me about like this kind of thinking, this very left-leaning thinking, is that most of the time it's going to hurt the people that they try and claim that they care about, right? And because before they were like, well, what about all the autoimmune people that can't get the vaccine? Like, you can't kick them out. Like, that causes COVID. And it's like, and now you've got, they're repping this landlord that's going to evict people that don't have the vaccination. And that's just so typical, right? The very thing that these things purport to like help, it doesn't, and it actually hurts even more than it helps.
The funny thing is, when you brought up that point, I thought you were going to go with the other angle, which is that minority communities are the ones that are largely unvaccinated. Yeah, and they're Occupy Democrats is talking about systemic racism. Well, if you want an example of systemic racism, any sort of, and this isn't a government, systemic racism, but they would argue that a private actor in this capacity would constitute systemic racism, right? The system set up against them for in industry as well.
Well, did you see the thing about? I'm sure you've seen that article about the New York restaurant that had the waiter like assaulted by the people that asked. Well, it turns out they were I think it was 5 black women. And they were really irritated that the person that was going to show them to their seats asked for their vaccination status, right? Because it turns out, the cops in New York City know that like the black community is the least vaccinated among all the communities in New York City. And so they tend to target them when they're asking for proof of vaccine. And so these black women got really irritated about that, and it created this whole thing. What's funny though, right, is the news... That's like that narrative can't exist, right? Like where it's like, oh, like unvaccinated, stupid Trump supporter, and that's like what they want you to think. So they'll omit anything like that, from the article and everything. But yeah, and then eventually it comes out these women were irritated because they thought they were being discriminated against because it was being assumed that they had fake vaccine, passports, which obviously we hate those vaccine passports. But so yeah, just really funny how. And just to your and I's point of, throughout this whole podcast, right, is like these people don't actually care about the principle. They don't actually believe the things they say, because the second that what they believe comes in conflict with them having power, they're going to totally swap their view. And that makes it evil and cringy.
Yeah, exactly. Well put. And I think what you and I would say in a lot of it is that like we care about the principle, or you and I would support the principles that we do because ultimately those are the principles that help people and that promote human flourishing. The ideas of liberty and those kinds of things are what help humanity in general. And that's why we love these principles and why they're right and why they're moral in many ways. And so speaking of that, we're going to take our next cringe post, which is from a verified user as well, Michael Knowles, who is part of the Daily Wire, which is the outfit run by Ben Shapiro and has Andrew Klavan and Matt Walsh, I believe. And I think now Candace Owens,
yes,
or something. Anyway, so for the record, I will say that Michael Knowles, I'm very hit or miss on him. He's not always the worst. I was listening to a podcast of his with Michael Malice the other day, and it was really entertaining, and I thought he did a good job, going back and forth with Malice without, disparaging and stuff like that too much. And so I was kind of, more bullish on him than normal. And then I saw this tweet and it like completely undid all that, which he's quote tweeting the Libertarian Party of Texas, and the Libertarian Party of Texas tweets Michael Malice's famous quote, which is "Conservatism equals progressivism driving the speed limit." And to that, Michael Knowles quote tweets saying, "Libertarianism equals a utopian ideology based on a false anthropology that inevitably accelerates, rather than impedes, the advance of progressivism by undermining the order, structures, and traditions on which free societies rely." I don't know if you have initial thoughts on this, if you want to jump in before I go off on it.
But one of the things I like, Michael Knowles, like when I listen to his podcast, like he's really good on certain things, but he's not good for the right reasons, if that makes sense. And
sure,
he's, and that's what's so interesting about him. He's very principled and very very conservative. Whereas I think Ben Shapiro's slightly more libertarian, obviously not in anything foreign policy or related to Israel. But yeah, Knowles, but he's very he's principled in a very pragmatic fashion. He's like, I see a society that I want. I know that societies that are this way are going to be better. And so whatever way of power that I have to take to get that is what we're going to do. So for example, one of the things that really bugs me about him is like he's against legalization of marijuana, right? Or he's very much against marijuana in general. And then he's an ad, he on air talks about, that he'll drink whiskey or he'll like smoke a cigar and stuff. I'm like, man, like that's just like, how can you not see the glaring, hypocrisy in that? And the way that he like counters that, he's like, well, alcohol and cigars and stuff have become like part of our, culture that we can serve. And it's just like, okay, dude, like you've kind of like, You've convinced yourself of your own positions, and you're not really concerned with being philosophically consistent. And that's why I think libertarianism bothers him so much, is because it I think you and I've heard it before, but like, if you're truly a libertarian if the society you live in might not be exactly the way you want it, but you'd be okay with it because everyone was free to make their own decisions, right? And that's why he hates libertarianism, or no, doesn't hate, but thinks it's the way it is. Yeah.
I was pretty sure you were going to say, you're a libertarian if everyone says you're not a libertarian, and then you're
that works
in
too.
A room full of libertarians. Then no, but yeah, and it's a point well taken, and I think the funny thing is, his argument for the culture of fabric that we conserve, in terms of alcohol or cigars or tobacco. That kind of demonstrates the entire premise that conservatism is progressivism driving the speed limit, right? If you went back,
yeah,
you can choose different starting points, but if you look at at least certain sects of conservatism prior to that, no gambling, no smoking, no drinking, and and so why is that not the conservatism that you're conserving? Maybe you're arguing things before that, but the point is that you flip-flop in the culture, and so when you have a ideology, I guess, that you could call conservatism that doesn't have base principles and is entirely reactionary and subjective, then you do end up with that problem that you're only ever in a position to react to things. You're only able to say, well, we're relative to this is our position. So the conservatives of tomorrow will be saying that marijuana is part of the cultural fabric and, crack is not. And so, yeah, it's funny because I understand when he sees that society that he wants and he wants to work toward it, I understand and sympathize a little bit because, like, I don't like marijuana. I don't like drug use. I think it's kind of annoying. I think it smells bad. But I also recognize that there are people who don't like some guilty pleasures that I have, right? Like, there are a lot of people, look at China banning, or not banning, but reinforcing policies on children gaming for only 3 hours a week, 1 hour a day on each of the days of the weekend. And it's like, when you get to a society that takes one person's entertainment or one person's pleasure and cracks down on it and says I think that this is an unhealthy thing for society, I'm going to ban it. You realize that the only thing that matters is who's in the reins of power. And so then it just becomes a race to building power again. And so when he criticizes libertarianism as inevitably accelerating rather than impeding advances of progressivism because you undermine order, structures, traditions, I think what he misses is that to some extent this is true in that you don't have those structures preventing that behavior on a legal level. But what you end up with is a much more middle ground where you have a free society where smaller communities can arise in those, structures and those cultures and those traditions. They can form still in a free society. Whereas when you have a society that enforces those, eventually the wrong people get into power and then they have the structure of power to put their own traditions.
And we're seeing it right now.
Structures.
Right.
Exactly right. So I think that, if he's saying libertarianism drags us here on the chart of progressivism, I'd say, yeah, but then you stop here because then people within here are free. You can be here, you can be here, you can peacefully coexist. Whereas conservatism, by setting up these structures, you're just inevitably going there and you're going to keep going further until there's a point of no return.
Yeah, when you're talking about drugs and everything, I was reminded of Ron Paul in debates when they were talking about legalizing drugs. And Ron Paul asked the audience, he's like, hey, if cocaine was legalized tomorrow, how many of you would go out and get cocaine? And everyone laughed, right? Because everyone there is not going to go get cocaine, right? Just because it's legal doesn't mean that everyone's going to go do that. And, what Knowles misses so much is that change within a person doesn't come because something is legal or illegal, right? It comes because someone's made a better argument or they've reached out to a person on a personal level. And that's how true change and how you get a society of virtue that you do desire, right? And I sympathize with some of the conservative principles in that you can't have a free society unless people are virtuous. I can understand that. But it's okay, well, what are the bedrock virtues that you have to have, right? And that's hey, I'm not going to be an authoritarian over you. I value freedom and liberty. And he clearly doesn't value those things, right? Because you were using the Chinese example of 3 hours of gaming and then banning, effeminate men from ads and stuff like that. And Knowles on his podcast is very much like thinks that's a good thing, right? He's like they're enforcing their cultural will on people. And I think all you have to do to kind of counteract his argument about this is that, hey, like you had 4 years of Donald Trump that could wield unlimited power and did wield basically unlimited power, used his power for all of 2020 to lock people down and enforce mask mandates and all these other things. And now that you have a Democratic president, he's wielding that same power plus more, right? So, yeah, your conservatism doesn't stop anything, right? If anything, the very definition he says that libertarianism is can be applied to conservatism. What more is utopian than believing that conservatism from the 1900s is the same conservatism today? It's not at all.
Yeah. Well, and if we're going to be generous to Donald Trump, let's say he wielded this power, but was undermined every step of the way. Okay. Well then, gosh, if Donald Trump, who is one of the most gregarious and not traditionally conservative, whatever that means in many ways, right? He was very anti-free trade and stuff like that. But let's say he was culturally conservative, or he was going to push make America great again. Let's just use the slogan, right? If he was unable to do that because he was so undermined and hated, then what good is conservatism at all if the state is just going to prevent you from using it as a mechanism to do the good that you want it to do? At the very least, Knowles should say, I don't agree with every end goal of libertarianism, but like I'm with you 90% so that we can reduce the size of the thing so that I can, take it over to impose my cultural norms and whims. Because, like you said, in scenario A, Donald Trump wielded a lot of power, which I think he did, and used it poorly, and now Biden's using that power in even worse ways. Or scenario B, Donald Trump got into the position of power, was completely and utterly unable to use it because it was used against him. And so then conservatism doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
Because
what have you conserved?
Institutions and the institutions that you want to use and you want to wield the power that you do to conserve whatever it is are actively working against you and don't work for you. So it's just a lose-lose. So I mean, again, from my perspective, I think he should at least see libertarianism as sort of the least of all evils. I don't see how you can look at the last presidential cycle and where we are today and think that conservatism has any chance of affecting any real change anymore.
I agree with you on that.
Okay, moving on to the next one. We have a Facebook post. This is just a really great, easy whataboutism. The post reads, "Why do I support canceling student debt for 45 million students? Because we canceled trillions in taxes for 600 billionaires. That's why." Like, oh, checkmate. Burr, burr, burr. What? Why do I support setting the roof on fire? Because the kitchen countertops are also on fire. That's why.
Yeah,
that's not a good argument.
See, there's someone in my life that makes these sorts of arguments, but they make it a little bit differently, and I can get the appeal of it, right? Because he would say, hey, like, we should cancel student loan debt, or we should have universal health care instead of us going over and bombing a bunch of brown people, in Afghanistan. Yeah. I can kind of get on board with that, right? If I'm going to get robbed, I would rather it go towards something like that here at home than going towards a bunch of bombs in another foreign country. But this just totally misses the point. It's like, I would be interested to see if this person could, do an actual economic analysis of like, okay, yeah, you cancel trillions of dollars in taxes for these 600 billionaires or their companies, right? It's like the often cited stat, Amazon pays 0 in taxes. It's like, yeah. Yes, but also no, right? Like,
right.
all I think they've got 140,000 employees or something like that. Maybe it's more. but all their wages are taxed. All the wages for all of Amazon corporate, all those people's wages are taxed. All of the sales tax for all the different states for all the products that they sell. And yeah, maybe they don't pay sort of corporate tax, but Amazon in of itself is paying hundreds of millions, if not billions in dollars in taxes every year just from existing, right? And that's not to mention the fact that the people that work there and draw a salary go and buy stuff and pay taxes on the stuff that they buy. If you ask any state, hey, do you want Amazon here or do you not want them here? But they're going to say we want them here, right? Because it's going to be it's the natural thing that is going to boom. So yeah, I can kind of understand some of this though, where it's like hey, like if you're going to give some of these wealthy elite a break, why not give the poor people a break? But that is not what they really mean when they say this. They're going after the AOC targeted billionaires and companies that they own.
Well, and the problem is that I agree that I can understand sort of the sympathetic argument, but like forgiving the student loan debt for 45 million students, it's rough because I do agree that those students that have this debt are in a bind.
Yeah.
I also would say that a loan is very different than taxation, where taxes are taken involuntarily because you've produced something, whereas a loan is something you're borrowing and promise to pay back.
And you gave your word, yeah.
Right. But I also recognize that there's a lot of sort of predatory loan nature in the education cartel, that is the government-run education and government-subsidized education, that's made it to the point where you have to get a loan in many cases to go to college. You don't have to if you're smart, but for a lot of people, they have to do that. But I also recognize that that's because the government intervention is what has created that need in the first place. And so forgiving all of this debt isn't going to ameliorate the problem, right? It's like you might put a Band-Aid for the current students who are real people with real lives, and I recognize that, but you don't actually address the issue, which is that there are inflated prices of education because of these government subsidies and loan programs. And so by forgiving the 45 million students, student debt now, you end up making it worse for the next 45 million by twofold. Yep. And again, canceling trillions in taxes for 600 billionaires, a lot of it's probably, crony capitalism, corporate bailout, and so it's not ideal. But also, like, equating the idea of canceled taxes with canceling, student loan debt they're not equitable at all. It's in the same way where it's like if you canceled my taxes, I'd be thrilled and happy. But I'm sure of those 600 billionaires, not everyone is totally necessarily corrupt. But even if they are, you're still getting a much better value out of that just in the short term on the principle of return without actually breaking a system inherently like you would be doing by forgiving student loan debt to that massive degree.
This is maybe we've done this one and maybe we'll do it in the future, but it reminds me of another meme I see all the time where they're joking about, hey, like we should set a rule in our country that the maximum amount of money you can ever own is $999 million. And after that, you don't get any more because you've won. You've won the whole game. Like, it's over. You shouldn't make any more money than that. And it's like, man, like these people think that like the world is infinitely better off by having companies like Amazon or Microsoft. Like Microsoft, by simply existing and employing the hundreds of thousands of people that it does, and then all of its software products that enable people to have a job as well. Millions of people have a job because of Microsoft products. That does more and will do infinitely more good for the world than when Bill Gates gives away all of his money, right, for all of his charitable causes. And that's what these people don't seem to grasp, is like when more value is brought to the table, it's generated, when value that was going to be discarded is, repurposed and given to other people, when, these businesses shoot up and are able to make something awesome, like I can push a button and I can have something show up the next day at my doorstep, everyone is better off. And it's really a tragedy. It's kind of like we were talking about earlier, the very people that these people say they're trying to help are actually hurt by these type of policies. It reminds me of when Sawant, the city councilwoman here in Seattle, was trying to do the head tax on Amazon. And for those of you who aren't here from Washington, basically they wanted to implement a tax. I can't remember how much it was. It was something like $1,000 or something like that per head if you lived in or worked in Seattle for a company. So for Amazon, with all their corporate employees, it's a lot of money. And so Amazon said, hey, that's cool, you can do that, but we're going to move we're going to stop construction of our headquarters here in Seattle. We're going to move it over to Bellevue. And Sawant, the city councilwoman who was advocating for it, was going to go speak somewhere, and all of the construction workers that were off work because Amazon was moving their stuff, they didn't blame Amazon. They knew who to blame. They blamed Sawant, and they were screaming at her, no head tax. And her being the Marxist that she is, she's like, my construction brothers, like, I hear you, and they're like, no head tax. It was awesome, right? And the very people that she tries to help.
I think she even shouted at them like, I'm trying to help you. Like, don't you understand? I think she said something like, you dolts, you idiots, you lowly people. You can't understand the wisdom of a politician like me.
Yeah. And that's what's so funny is if these people, I thank God they don't have the power to do this, but if they could snap their fingers and make these big companies disappear overnight, they would do it, and then everyone would die. That they kind of claim would happen, with stuff like net neutrality or whatever, because it's always everyone's going to die. But it really would. A lot of people would die if you made these companies stop existing, and you could basically legislate them to stop existing by taking away any profit motive, right? That's what they essentially want. With that meme I was talking about earlier, and with this as well.
Yeah, I think it's really a tragedy that we, as a culture, don't understand the value that profit-generating entities do create and give something in value. It's sort of like we're taught that, organizations that are tax exempt are doing so because they're charitable and they're giving, their proceeds and providing a service without profit, and that's a good model for some types of organizations, but it's almost come at the cost that we've traded in the idea that companies that generate revenue for themselves are providing value, which is just so patently on its face not true. They're obviously creating value for you and I. I mean, just like the fact that people even are grumble about things like I miss Blockbuster, and Netflix and all these streaming services are they're fragmented, they're everywhere, and it's like you realize that the fact that I can binge something on my TV without getting up for myself, without having to drive, without having to make any returns, and the fact that I can do that, and let's say I pay for multiple streaming services, I'm still getting all of that for so much cheaper than I could at Blockbuster. Even though you might think, oh, it was only $1 a movie a day or something. It's like, yeah, but Netflix, even if you're doing like a $12 subscription a month, that's less than $1 a day. And you're not limited to one movie
infinite
per day.
Infinite movies for as many times as I want, right?
Yeah, so it's like even when there are fragmented ecosystems with different shows and stuff, it's like there was also Hollywood Movie and things like that. There were other stores that did it's not, people like to think about that. So all that being said, these companies that create value in non-monetary ways for you or intangible, it's not like Netflix. I love Netflix because they built a well, on the farmer's property or something like that. It's like that's the only way people can perceive value. Or it's like, oh, this organization donated to help starving kids. Like those are good things, but it's not the only form of value. And you are getting brought value, and people in lower classes who don't have as much are also getting that same kinds of value. Because a lot of the value that gets brought to me gets brought to them equally, right?
Well, the Netflix one's a great example, because it's not, the value isn't, even if you just remove the value from the customer, right? Like people could say, well, that's not that big of a value to stream movies as much as you want. Okay, but think about all of the filmmakers now that are able to make films and get them out there to millions of people, right? Lots of people have been, I think of the cast from Stranger Things. All those people are now doing whatever, and not just the cast, right? It's all of the people that worked on that show, all of the people that provided catering for that, and then you think about, okay, Netflix has got all these employees, right, that work for them, that are able to feed their families, and by feeding their families, they have to go patronize, whatever restaurant is in their area, so that restaurant now can have, more and more business and all this stuff. So it's like when a new business pops up and it provides something that is valuable for society, everyone is way better off than you could ever imagine. You almost can't even trace the positive effects of it because it reaches so far. Milton Friedman, whatever you may think of him, has that great example of, hey, what does it take to make a pencil, right? If you wanted to make a pencil yourself, it would be impossible because you'd have to learn about how to mine, rubber from down in Brazil. You'd have to figure out how to chop down a tree and then mill it into the, the little circle that it is. You'd have to figure out how to get lead, and to figure out how to get lead, you'd have to figure out how to design a mining machine and all these things. Something that you could never do in your lifetime. You could never amass enough expertise to do that. But the market is able to come together because some people have rubber, some people have lead, some people have wood, and people have a way to ship it from point A to point B, and you're able to go to the store and buy 50 of these pencils for $10, right? And that's really cool that pencil existing is able to employ so many people and pull people out of poverty and all those things. But when you eliminate the profit motive, if you eliminate the billionaires and the smart people that make these companies happen, if you eliminate the companies that exist and make these things happen, you don't get a pencil. You don't get anything, in fact.
Right. And all of that on the tangent that, giving trillions in taxes for 600 billionaires, even if there was some level of cronyism, I guess I'd rather there be fewer taxes collected in general.
Yep.
Targeted taxes aren't great, and I don't like corporate welfare. I really don't. But again, just even if you assume at the very base level that that's an evil, it's like, okay, but canceling student loan debt for 45 million students is also kind of an evil in the sense that you ruin the price signals there, you ruin the control, you inflate college tuitions, you inflate loan rates. I mean, there's just all kinds of problems with that.
Not to mention, it's money from normal people that you're like, technically those people borrowed from you and I and their fellow citizens, right? If we're to believe that it's all into one pot, right? So yeah, technically they're stealing that. Those people borrowed from their neighbors and they're trying to not pay it back. That's not right either.
It's not a great solution. And so just the comparison between the two is just really funny. Again, let's assume both are, this is just someone who is looking for an excuse to justify them wanting to cancel the student debt. And then, we also spent money here, so that's why. And it's not a one-for-one. It doesn't make a lot of sense, and they need to still do the work of saying why canceling student loan debt actually helps fix a problem, which I think will inevitably become worse if it is. So enough on that. We have our last post for the day. And this one's a long one. It's from 2018, but has been making the rounds lately. So we're going to read it out. So bear with me here as we read this post. The unborn are a convenient group of people to advocate for. They never make demands of you. They are morally uncomplicated, unlike the incarcerated, addicted, or the chronically poor. They don't resent your condescension or complain that you are not politically correct. Unlike widows, they don't ask you to question patriarchy. Unlike orphans, they don't need money, education, or childcare. Unlike aliens, they don't bring all that racial, cultural, and religious baggage that you dislike. They allow you to feel good about yourself without any work at creating or maintaining relationships. And when they are born, you can forget about them because they cease to be unborn. It's almost as if, by being born, they have died to you. You can love the unborn and advocate them without substantially changing your own wealth, power, or privilege, without reimagining social structures, apologizing, or making reparations to anyone. They are, in short, the perfect people to love if you want to claim that you love Jesus, but actually dislike people who breathe. Prisoners, immigrants, the sick, poor, widows, orphans, all the groups that are specifically mentioned in the Bible, they all get thrown out under the bus for the unborn. What I love, just to start, is that all of this can be true. Like, if you take all of this at face value, and that still does not change the fact that an unborn child is an unborn human who doesn't deserve to die.
Yep.
None of that addresses the core argument of a pro-life position, and we'll break down all the other stuff. But even if you completely 100% agree with him, you still have zero argumentation against the pro-life position that you should not be able to kill an unborn child. None of this addresses that. So if you saw this post and if you were thinking, oh man, like, I don't know how to respond to that, the first thing you can say is, okay, but we still can't kill children.
Yeah, it reminds me of because when I hear people make the argument, well, what about in cases of sexual assault or incest, or where the threat, the mother's life is unthreatened. It's like, okay, sure, like let's even just take those off the table, right? Like, because those take up maybe less than half of a percentage of the 700,000 abortions that happen every year in the United States. for the other 699,900, like, do you support us not having, that's not a good thing for people to do that. And that usually reveals whether it's an actual argument, whether this is someone that you can actually have a dialogue with about this, because then it actually takes that objection off the table. The thing that I really find cringy about this specific post, though, is that this person has no understanding of like charitable giving in the United States. They specifically talk about, well, it's convenient for you to advocate for the unborn because no one in your community, and I think he's kind of talking about like Christians because he says Jesus, like, you guys don't reduce your wealth or power to help the sick, the needy, the orphan or whatever. It's like, man, you don't know anything about charity in the United States. Christians and people that are part of religious institutions are by far, they outgive non-Christians 2-to-1 in terms of how much they give to private charity. And then the private charities they do give to outperform the government 70%, right? So 70% of every dollar you give to a private charity goes to the actual person that you are trying to help. Well, 30% goes to administrative cost. With the government, social programs and all this stuff, 30% of those dollars goes to the actual person, 70% to administrative overhead, which is kind of crazy. And this kind of reminds me of a conversation I had with a coworker of mine about this topic. And he was trying to say, he's like, well, sure, Christians outgive, non-Christians 2-to-1, but you guys only give to charities for things that you think are going to make people more like you. And I was like, well, okay, that's kind of nebulous. Give me an example. He's like, well, for example, you would never give to a charity that supports women after they have an abortion. And I had to tell him, like, dude, I have a family member who literally works for a charity that does that. Yeah. I've given money to like 3 charities that do that, right? Like, Yep. Like you don't. It's you guys have like this animus in your head about, and it's based on a lie perpetrated by the media and other posts like this. Like, this is one of the reasons we exist, is to dispel myths like this. They just have no understanding, right? And it's their ignorance is so cringy because the very people that actually are doing something are the people that they're criticizing.
Totally. And I mean, another great stat, not even aside from charitable giving, is also look at adoption rates. Look at who's doing the most adoption consistently. I mean, I'm thinking about people I've known from the pro-life movement. And it's like, yeah, those are people that are giving to all kinds of charities. And someone I know is from that movement is running an absolutely wonderful clinic in the heart of Seattle, right next to UW, for women for their health issues. And it's like a free clinic, right? Like, women who have problems, who can't afford, literally go in and get free service from medical doctors and stuff like that, right? It's like they're servicing the people who are the most needy, the most helpless. And it's like, it's just like, these are people I'm meeting in these pro-life circles, because generally people who are pro-life value the sanctity of life. And, if I'm going to be the most accommodating of this post, I would say that you can take this position on sort of the political pro-life movement, which you Sure. can be cynical about, and I understand that. But rather than addressing that political component, he makes broad generalizations about the general population, and he makes these sweeping statements about how the unborn are this convenient group. For one thing, this entire post feels very dehumanizing of unborn children. It really seeks to isolate them from personhood, because he lists off all the things they are not, all the things that, they don't ask you to question patriarchy or whatever. They don't ask you all these sorts of things. And it's just kind of, it's almost a little creepy to me. I mean, I know that's how a lot of people do think, but it's just really creepy. It's like, yeah, but you do realize that they're still living, breathing people, right? You know that babies don't question the patriarchy when they're born from the womb, right? Like, your 3-month-old, regardless of what your Twitter friend tweets, isn't watching the TV when Trump gets elected saying, "We will fight this." That's not what your 3-month is saying. And it's just, again, so it's like he lumps the unborn as this, like, sort of this null creature, this void thing, and it's like, you could apply a lot of this to about infants as well, and that doesn't change their personhood, doesn't change any of that, except that you might argue that it's saying that the challenge changing your own wealth, power, or privilege. But again, I just don't think that that's actually true, because taking a pro-life position means that you would have to hold that position for everyone in your life, even your own accountability. Now, whether or not, you hold that position in your personal life, like let's say, you get a woman pregnant as a guy, and then you advocate for her to have an abortion, well, then you're not really pro-life, are you, right? Because that pro-life position would require you to change your own wealth, power, or privilege. So he's saying you can love the unborn and advocate them without changing them. And that's not necessarily true by any stretch of the imagination. And people who want to cop out, who are scared of that, who give way, then yeah, but that's not a pro-life position to say everyone else needs to, preserve the life, but in my specific circumstance, you can get an abortion. That's just taking the worst application of a hypocrite and then applying it to the general philosophy. So. Yep. I just don't understand how you can think of all these things, make generalizations about a population that is just statistically, it's just statistically untrue. All these things that he, slanders them with, and then try to somehow make that an argument about, why that maybe justifies taking a pro-choice position. I guess that would be his contention here. I'm not sure.
Yeah, this makes me think of, like, the left does this a lot. Some people purposefully, other people's unconsciously. And I'll get to the unconscious people in a minute, but they kind of Trojan horse like outcomes with policies, or maybe it's the reverse of that, where they basically try and say, well, you don't want people to die and all these things. So if you don't want people to die, then you must approve universal health care. It's like, wait a second. Like, you're right. Like, I don't want people to needlessly suffer. I don't want the widows to be poor and destitute and all this stuff. And they say, well, if you really did care about that, then you would vote for universal health care. And it's like you're linking these two things. Like, yeah, we agree on where we want to go, right? Like, libertarians and free market people, they're not, sadists that want people to die and hurt. We believe in our philosophy because we believe it works, right? We see it in every single important aspect of our lives. Freedom and voluntary choice works, and it leads to the best outcome. And I think it really speaks to how these people, like, they can't imagine, they associate so closely this outcome with this government policy that to oppose the policy means that you hate people, right? You hate poor people.
Right.
And it just shows that how they put government on this pedestal, right? My favorite line in this guy's post is, prisoners, immigrants, the sick, orphans, all the groups that are specifically mentioned in the Bible, they all get thrown under the bus for the unborn. And it's like, you're literally throwing the baby out with the bathwater, with this, pun kind of intended, but it's like, just because your policy decisions, like, people that are pro-life sometimes don't agree with them, doesn't mean that they hate those people. Quite the opposite. And you can see that by their actions, right? You can see, like we talked about, the 2-to-1 giving, the fact that private charities are better for it, the fact that Christians and Mormons and all these different types of religious groups are usually the people on the front lines administering any sort of aid to anyone. I think you can see by their actions that this isn't the case. But they've just tied it so closely to their policy objectives and power that they want that it must be true that you're an evil person that hates all these people and you're only using the unborn as a shield.
Yeah, and it's funny. I do specifically wonder when he says, the groups, they all get thrown under the bus for the unborn. I don't see the argument there either. I don't, in his post, I don't get where he's making that. You can make your claim about how the unborn are a convenient group because they don't have all these problems, but he hasn't made a really good link to why they get thrown under the bus for the unborn, unless you're making the very general argument that there's opportunity cost and that when you advocate for the unborn, you're necessarily taking away your time, resources that you could be advocating for orphans or widows or whatever whatever your case may be. But at that point, it's like, okay, so I'm sure as heck hoping that you don't spend any advocacy time on any other issue other than immigrants, sick, poor, widows, orphans, or prisoners. If you advocate for environmental justice in any sort, sorry, can't do that. If you advocate for, I don't know, even like something on your school board, like education, like I don't know, like higher standards of education for your children, I don't know, that's time you could be spending, for the advocating for the widows and the orphans specifically, rather than just your local school board and your school standards for your own kids. There's any number of things you can do with opportunity cost. So he again throws in this, they all get thrown under the bus for the unborn. But that's just also just not you're presented a false choice at the end. Like, you can either be pro-life in the traditional sense, or you can support all these groups. And like you're saying with that Trojan horse thing, I hear oftentimes, you can't be pro-life if you don't support X, Y, or Z. It's like, no, I can, because what your policies that you're, submitting here are not equivalent of me saying that you can't murder babies just because they're not out.
And they don't accomplish what they say they're going to accomplish, right? Like, and that's the irony about it all.
Yeah, exactly right. And I mean, it's just kind of like, and just from a semantic point, I don't know. I find it's not very persuasive, and it's not very. You just kind of are an annoying person, in my opinion, if you do that. Even if I disagree with a conservative on foreign policy, I would probably approach, the idea of pro-life for them, but making a snarky, you can't be pro-life and support bombing the Middle East, and that's like taking a traditional term, pro-life, meaning something specifically, and then trying to pull a gotcha. It's like, I don't know. That's about as effective as saying to a left, someone on the left, like, oh yeah, well, when a pregnant woman gets murdered, it's a double homicide according to the law. Checkmate. It's just like, you're just playing semantic games at that point. It's not convincing, and you're not
annoying. Getting to the core. Yeah.
Right. Rather than addressing, with a conservative, you might say like, hey, I think we agree here on pro-life, that everyone has the right to life. So in my perspective, the innocent, bystander in the Middle East there who gets droned at a wedding because we're trying to go after terrorists, I think he has just as much a right to life. So that's my perspective. That's a much more nice way of going about it. The whole, you can't be pro-life, just like trying to gatekeep on semantics. It's just annoying. And I don't know that this specifically is committing that sin, but this post reeks of that. Like, oh, I'm going to take your terminology of sort of being pro-life and like advocating for what you would call harmless group and talk about why it actually isn't doing all these things. And again, never makes the claim of how you're not actually advocating for a vulnerable group in the unborn. He's just making the claim that they're easier to advocate for because they don't challenge you, which is just not true. But even if it was true, you're still advocating for a helpless group that can't defend themselves. He has done no work to show that they're not that. So.
Yep.
Anyway, I think that's all I've got, unless you have any last thoughts.
I'm good on this one.
All right. Well, thank you guys for listening to another episode. We are going to keep going right along, so make sure to check out our socials, Cringe Posts Pod. And, if you're watching this on YouTube or Odyssey, give us a thumbs up, like the video, subscribe. It helps us a lot. Leave a review if you can for the podcast, and we will see you on the next episode.
Catch you later.